Day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning, you're watching GB News, and coming up on the Political Correction today, we discuss the ongoing situation in Ukraine, where a strict curfew has been enforced in the capital, Kiev, as the country enters its fourth day under Russian invasion.
As COVID restrictions come to an end in the UK, we discuss mask wearing and isolation.
And we discuss new guidance in Scotland, which some campaigners have argued effectively lowers the age of consent to just 13.
That plus plenty more after the latest news.
Good morning, I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Russian forces have entered Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv. Intensive rocket artillery exchanges overnight have been followed by heavy fighting in the area. In Kiev, Ukrainians engaged with Russian-backed forces for the second night in a row as Russian forces prioritise encircling the capital. The Ukrainian president said the night had been brutal, with shelling of civilian buildings and attacks on everything, including ambulances. Volodymyr Zelensky's announced Ukraine is setting up a foreign legion to bring in volunteers from abroad. More than 150,000 Ukrainians have already fled for Poland, Moldova and other neighbouring countries. Boris Johnson says the UK will take refugees fleeing the war.
Things are not going all the way of President Putin. Very far from it. The Ukrainians are fighting heroically and in some places with great success, as many of us thought they would, because they're a great country and a very brave country. But as you rightly point out, there are some terrible atrocities being committed, and there will be some very grim days ahead for Ukraine.
The Ukrainian president says he's ready for peace talks with Russia, but not in Belarus, because it served as a staging ground for the invasion. The Kremlin says a Russian delegation, including military officials and diplomats, has arrived in the Belarusian city of Gomel for talks with Ukrainian officials. President Zelensky has suggested other locations, such as Istanbul and Budapest. Russian oligarchs are the latest targets of sanctions by the UK as Foreign Secretary Liz Truss prepares what she calls a hit list. The UK and other Western allies have agreed to disconnect selected Russian banks from SWIFT, the international banking messaging system. It'll help put a stop to Russia conducting most of its financial transactions worldwide. Vicky Price from the Centre of Economics and Business Research told GB News the move could inflict a crippling economic blow on Roscoe.
It will be painful for Russia, without any doubt. I mean, Russia is dependent on those exports in order to distribute the money, if you like, to the population and keep them happy. Something like 40% of all the tax revenues that Russia collects come from oil and gas, for example. I mean, that's huge. If any of that is disrupted, then, you know, there are question marks as to how do you continue with funding the military or anything else.
Meanwhile, former US President Donald Trump has condemned Russia's invasion, calling the attack appalling. He also said that he's praying for the proud people of Ukraine. But speaking at CPAC, the annual Conservative conference in Florida, Donald Trump also described President Putin's action as genius and pretty savvy.
The Russian attack on Ukraine is appalling. It's an outrage and an atrocity that should never have been allowed to occur. It never would have occurred. We are praying for the proud people of Ukraine. God bless them all.
North Korea has fired what could be a ballistic missile. It's the first since conducting a record number of launches back in January. Japan's Coast Guard reported the launch amid stalled denuclearization talks with the United States. Police forces in England and Wales have recorded the highest numbers of rapes since Sarah Everard's murder almost a year ago. The Office for National Statistics also recorded the second highest number of sexual offences since April last year. Ms Everard was killed by serving Met Officer Wayne Couzens in South London in March last year. Jamie Klinger from Reclaim These Streets says her murder was a watershed moment for women's safety that's been wasted by the government.
We need to overall understand the deep levels of misogyny within the Met, and they need to be exposed and accounted for. A year going by with none of the stuff that was promised from the government and the police happening is quite devastating.
And rail firms are ramping up services that had been cancelled due to COVID. Avanti West Coast and East Midlands Railway are bringing back lines cut in December and January. For those coming to London, North Wales and Chester will get a second daily service to and from the capital, and trains from Manchester and Birmingham to Euston will be doubled from Monday. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now it's back to the political correction.
Good morning. You're watching GB News and this is the political correction.
We're here for the next 2 hours to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. This is not about journalists talking to journalists. It's about you telling us what you think. So coming up this hour.
As hundreds of thousands of people flee Ukraine, we discuss the ongoing situation and ask, where do we go from here?
As COVID restrictions come to an end in the UK, we discuss mask wearing and self-isolation.
And we discuss new guidance in Scotland, which some campaigners have argued effectively lowers the age of consent to just 13.
And as always, we want to hear from you today, so please get involved by emailing us at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is the political correction.
In the early hours of Thursday morning, Russia launched its invasion of neighbouring Ukraine.
Tens of thousands of Ukrainians have since fled the country as fierce battles continue and the death toll continues to rise.
For weeks here on the political correction, we've discussed the possibility of a full-scale Russian invasion. What were the initial reactions as we saw the events unfolding on Thursday? I mean, Arlene, we woke up to that horrible news that Russian troops had been deployed into Ukraine and that sort of airstrikes were taking place. Well, what were your thoughts?
Well, it was a little surreal because we had been talking about it for so long and there had been some people saying that this was all just geopolitical gameplay. There wasn't going to be an invasion. If there was going to be an invasion, it was going to be very much limited to the eastern region, the Donbass region, where there had been separatists active for 7 years since the Crimea was taken over by Russians. So I think that the scale of the invasion and the scope of the invasion, Deanna, has been really quite shocking, I think, for most people. But I have to say, our own intelligence agencies seem to be on top of the issue at the time, and that's good to see.
Yeah, I agree. And Paul, were you quite surprised by the sort of speed with which the Russian troops moved in?
Well, as you know, I was one of those skeptics. I was skeptical because, let's be blunt, the history of Western intelligence over recent years hasn't been too illustrious. You know, when you look at the predictions that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, that turned out to be wrong. You look more recently at the predictions from the Western intelligence services that the Taliban wasn't going to come back into power in Afghanistan anytime soon. And obviously they were completely wrong about that. So I think a healthy dose of skepticism when you have the Western intelligence services saying to you, this is what we think is going to happen, is not necessarily a bad thing. I didn't necessarily expect the invasion to take place. I think it's a serious error by Vladimir Putin, but more importantly, it is an appalling act of aggression. There's no question about it. I think the premise on which it's been launched, you know, peacekeeping in the East is clearly bogus, and genocide against ethnic Russians in the East is also clearly bogus. Although, having said that, there is clearly some evidence of mistreatment of ethnic Russians in the East. There's no question about that. But I think, you know, there needs to be an immediate ceasefire. There needs to be the withdrawal of Russian troops, and proper diplomatic discussions need to begin on the basis of the future status of those regions of Luhansk and Donetsk in the East, on the basis of the Minsk agreement. which now seems to sadly have fallen by the wayside. But there is no question, I say that as a sceptic, there's no question it's an appalling act of aggression that's indefensible.
Well, you talked there about sort of diplomatic solutions, and a team of Russians have arrived now in Belarus saying they're willing to start peace talks. Yet the president of Ukraine has said he's not willing to attend any peace talks in Belarus, I think for understandable reasons, given that Belarus has acted as a sort of gateway into Ukraine for those Russian troops. I mean, are we confident that even if there were peace talks in slightly more neutral territory, that they'd actually be successful, Arlene?
Well, the first thing, and Paul's already referenced this, before peace talks can take place, the Russian troops have to withdraw from the Ukraine, or from Ukraine. I nearly said the Ukraine, of course, that's the Russian way of speaking about Ukraine. They need to withdraw from Ukraine because you cannot have peace talks when you're under attack and when you're being occupied. So that's the first thing that has to happen. And then I think it's absolutely understandable that President Zelensky is saying that you can't have these peace talks in Belarus because actually some of the attacks have been launched from Belarus and actually you need to be in a neutral environment to do that, and he has suggested other environments where it could take place.
Paul, what about you? I mean, you've clearly there called for a ceasefire, which I think is something that we'd all like to see. But do you think that's actually, likely given the sort of Russian aggression we've seen so far?
No, sadly, I don't. I don't think it's likely anytime soon. But obviously, that shouldn't stop the international community from making the demand. One other thing that always concerns me, and I've been involved in a lot of anti-war campaigns throughout my political activity throughout my life, and the first few days of any conflict are usually characterised by a lot of hyperbole. People get whipped up into a frenzy. We've seen, some demands in this country, for example, for dual British-Russian nationals to be forced to choose one nationality, and one MP suggesting that we can deport all Russians. And I think we need to be careful of that. I think we need to keep level heads. And I do think, and I have to say this, Deanna, and it's not particularly fashionable to say it at the moment, I do think we have to place this dispute in context. There is no question that what Putin has done is utterly appalling and indefensible. But the context, unfortunately, is that, NATO has been wooing Ukraine for a number of years now, despite the fact that we had previously promised Russia, NATO had previously, the Western sphere had promised Russia that NATO wasn't going to move further eastwards. And I get when people say, look, Ukraine is a sovereign country and should be entitled to enter into any alliance it sees fit. I understand that and I defend that principle. But you also have to realise that that works both ways. And, the truth is that some people in Russia have seen the advance of NATO eastwards as a threat to their security. And I would pose it in this way. Imagine, for example, Russia and China entered into a military alliance. And that military alliance then decided to court, let's say, Mexico on the US border. And Mexico, responded to those overtures and said, yeah, we'd be quite happy to be part of your military alliance. I think the idea that the White House would say nothing about that, or would simply say, well, we defend the right of Mexico to enter into its own military alliances because it's a sovereign country, is completely fanciful. We know that is not what would happen. And indeed, it didn't happen, did it, in the 1960s when the Soviet Union tried to base missiles on Cuba. So context is important. And I do wonder whether, goading Russia in the way that NATO did by continuing to move eastwards hasn't backfired on us. And that is not to in any way defend Putin. I'm utterly opposed to Putin. The man's a tyrant. But it's simply to make the point that you have to tread carefully with this sort of thing because it can implode, and on this occasion it has done in the most tragic way. And that debate should not be off limits. We should be having that debate, in my view.
Yeah, I think we obviously should be having that debate, but of course there is no justification for Putin's aggression. Paul, I think we agree on that. And I also think that we should have a conversation about Putin's state of mind. I mean, when we look at some of the videos that he has put out there, they seem to be getting more and more aggressive. He talks about Finland and Sweden. Don't you dare think about going into NATO or there'll be consequences. He talked about, of course, when he launched the attack on Ukraine, the need to denazify the Ukraine. I mean, that to me was a sign of something seriously wrong. And of course, given that President Zelensky is from a Jewish background, very, very offensive to the Ukrainian people. So I think we need to have a conversation as well about Putin's state of mind at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that has been, I don't quite want to say heartening because it seems heartless to say that in the circumstances, but the number of Ukrainians who are stepping forward to sign up to defend their country. You know, there have been queues hundreds of people long to actually sign up to serve their nation in this time of real crisis. I think that's something that, you know, is actually quite inspiring. And the way the Ukrainian people have come together to back Zelensky, back the president, you know, I'm really moved by that.
It is quite moving, and when you see stars like the boxer, is he Zelensky? I think so. Anyway, his brother is the mayor of Kiev, and seeing him, Klitschko, all dressed up in his military attire, they are the plucky underdogs, I think it's fair to say. And I noticed that the Daily Telegraph was referring to them this morning as the tracksuit army, which is quite the thing. But you're right. I mean, people are volunteering, and now President Zelensky has put out a call for people to come and help them in the Ukraine, and I think that it'll be interesting to see how many people react to that. Paul, do you think people will react to that, even from the UK?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that struck me actually is, in terms of what you're saying, the number of people rallying to the defence of their country shows that actually what matters most to people is their home, their families, and their country, and those are usually the things that people are willing to put their lives on the line for. And you know, I know we kind of live in an age where we think that those old-fashioned concepts of home and family and nation are now irrelevant, and we have people who seem to spend their time fighting for sort of abstract ideals, usually on social media in this country. But you know, when push comes to shove, people are prepared to go out and don a uniform and pick up a weapon if it's to defend their community and their loved ones and the country of which they're a citizen. And I don't think that's going to change. And some of the, you know, already some of the heroism, I think, has been remarkable, and the willingness. You know, you talk about the Klitschko's, Arlene, and also I think the Dynamo Kiev football team have also donned their khakis as well, and are off to fight. And you know, in some respects, it's wonderful to see. But at the same time, I do think it's important that we don't romanticize it. Because, of course, this is still a very gruesome war, and what we are seeing are innocent people being cut down. We're seeing lives being torn apart, and you know, it's important that we don't, in the West, see it as some sort of computer game where we're just, you know, impassive bystanders. It's a very, very serious business, and the sooner it ends, the better.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And of course, we're seeing young Russians being killed as well. So we have to remember that as well. Young boys of 17, 18, 19 being put out to fight in a war that their families probably don't want them to be involved in. So we will now turn the conversation towards the international response to the crisis. Speaking this week, Prime Minister Boris Johnson said there were some very grim days ahead for Ukraine.
So the question is, has our response been enough, and should we and other Western nations be doing more? Well, joining us to discuss this and the situation as a whole is geopolitical analyst and journalist Patrick Henningsen. Patrick, thank you for joining us this morning. What has your read been of the international response in the past few days? I think particularly now seeing the international community come together and call for Russia to be cut out of SWIFT.
I think we have to be very, very cautious about the measures that are being taken. Certainly, if you look back in history, well, one major faux pas was already committed by the West, in which they lobbied sanctions onto Russia just for recognizing the breakaway republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. That's not against international law to recognize the independence of these two states. But yet they did that, and they signaled to Russia at that point that, you know, we're going to sanction you anyway, and members of your parliament for voting to recognize these breakaway republics. And so Russia at that point has nothing to lose. That's basically sanctions 101 is you don't take away the incentive leverage. And the West did that immediately by going crazy with what looks like a hysterical global reaction to sanction Russia before. The United States was threatening to sanction them before anything happened. And so that's obviously a mistake, because that signaled to Russia that, well, might as well go ahead and execute our military objectives anyway, and our political objectives. So that's the first mistake. The second mistake would be when you get into sanctioning the central bank of a country, when you get into seizing ships on the high sea, which we saw in the last couple of days in the English Channel, that's a prelude to a wider war. And if you look at history and you study it, this is exactly what happens when you start to interfere with commerce on the high seas in this way. And then there's the collective punishment aspect of it. Sanctions don't work. Look at any other example of this, from Iran to Syria, and there's so many other examples. They actually don't work over time, because if you're still threatening a country, there's no incentive for them to change their behavior. If you do lobby sanctions, that's just like basic sanctions theory, but it's amazing how our politicians haven't read the textbooks at all. They just use it as a sort of cudgel to think that they're going to change a country's behavior when in fact they don't. So from that point of view, I think it's a very dangerous road we're going on here, and basically sanctioning world leaders so they can't travel for negotiations. This might become a problem, because if Ukraine and Russia can't sit at a table because they can't meet in Switzerland, or they can't meet in Germany or some other neutral place, then the conflict will drag on. And so that's going to add to the complications and the problems. These things aren't often thought about, unfortunately, by our political leaders. So there's that aspect of it. And also, there's no context to this at all. The United Nations Resolution 2202 was backing the Minsk Accords. That was the mandate of the United Nations. And that's 7-8 years dragged on. And the guarantors of that, Germany and France, in the Normandy format, they didn't enforce it. And Ukraine's open position was they're not going to abide by the Minsk Accords, which was mandated by the UN, which was to de-escalate and have a ceasefire in the Donbass. They just abandoned it. And now the Western media and Western politicians are accusing Russia of walking away from the Minsk Accords, and that's the opposite of what actually happened. So in this information environment, we have two different narratives, two completely polar opposite narratives being spoken of in the West and by Russia. There's very little chance that I think that we're going to get any diplomatic resolution on this. It's a very dangerous environment when both sides are not listening to each other, and provable falsehoods are being spoken by leaders, in this case, by Western leaders as well. So this is not a really positive situation in that respect.
So I suppose my question in response, Patrick, is if you fear that sanctions at this stage are the wrong approach, then what would you consider the right approach to be from Western leaders?
The right approach would have been to follow the United Nations directive on the Minsk peace process. Then we wouldn't have gotten to this point to begin with. And at every turn, the United States actively undermined that. Britain pretty much looked the other way, acted like they didn't know anything about it. No pressure was put on Kiev to realize this peace process. There's 14,000 residents in the Donbass have been killed, residents and soldiers on both sides. So collectively, 14,000 victims, many of them civilians, and are being shelled to this day still. This is Russia's beef. And I find it amazing that this context is not even being spoken of on any mainstream media outlet in the West or from any politician. It's almost like they've canceled the people of the Donbass. They've kind of like disappeared them. They've dehumanized them in that sense. So these are people that have been under siege, as it were, from the Ukrainian military, from their own government in a bloody civil war for 8 years. That counts for nothing in the current discourse in the West. It's quite astonishing. So of course they're not going to be able to communicate with Moscow on this. So what's Moscow looking at this and saying? Well, they don't care about the United Nations. resolution. They don't care about the people of the Donbass. They don't care about the humanitarian disaster, the embargo. They've taken out electric. The Ukrainian army has hit the water supply. They've blockaded food going in there. I mean, it's a dire situation. And now the West is saying we need to ship weapons into the Ukraine, more weapons, more arms. And so that's effectively a proxy war, NATO versus Russia, using the Ukraine as the proxy. So any way you add it up, that's how it is on paper. So I really can't understand how this conversation hasn't developed to any kind of a sober.
One of the great things about GB News, Patrick, is that we can have these conversations and go places that the other news channels don't. Well, I'm afraid our time is up, Patrick. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and we'll go quickly to a break, after which we will be speaking about the threat of war in countries bordering Russia and Ukraine, so don't go anywhere.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to the Political Correction. And as ever, many of you have been getting in touch with us. Arlene?
So, yeah, we've had a wide range of views sent in, and that's the good thing about GB News, that we get a wide range. Ian says the best thing for both sides in this conflict is a speedy resolution. It may not be as feel-good as showing civilians taking up arms to defend, but in reality, urban conflict will lead to stalemate and mass death. I hope for the people of Ukraine it doesn't come to this.
Lucy here saying, a lesson we can all learn from Ukraine. NATO's not enough. Britain needs to properly invest in our armed forces so we can stand on our own 2 feet. We can't hide behind America forever.
And then on the issue of sanctions, Lily says sanctions are tricky. We want to hurt Putin and his gangster cronies, but could end up hurting decent, ordinary Russians as well. If Russia retaliates, ordinary Brits will be affected too.
And then we've got Dan here, and this is one that our next guest might quite enjoy. Thank goodness for Mark White and GB News. So much fake news about the conflict on social media. Well, you'll be pleased to know, GB News viewers, that the next person we're going to be talking to is our very own Mark White.
I'm blushing.
You're blushing. You're blushing.
All right.
Mark, this has been obviously a difficult few days for Ukraine and Russia, but maybe you could bring us up to date on where we are now.
Yes, I mean, in terms of the operation, the viewer that has written in there talks about the misinformation. There is a lot of misinformation. It's always confusing in these situations. And all we can do is try to attribute what claims are coming out to whoever is making those claims. So be it the Russian government, the Ukrainian government, or indeed the British Ministry of Defence. And I'm finding this quite helpful, actually. The MOD here in the UK have started putting out an intelligence analysis of the situation that they see on the ground, which I think from our point of view, it strikes me as being one of the more credible routes to look into what's going on. They clearly have intelligence assets on the ground. They have satellite imagery. They are in contact with those forces, of course, of the Ukrainian armed services involved in the fighting as well. Now, what they say is that Vladimir Putin's forces have not made the kind of progress that they would have hoped to make. Their day one objectives, according to James Heapy, the Armed Forces Minister yesterday, were not met. And that even today, any attempts to take over Ukrainian cities for the most part have not been met. We are hearing about some very intense fighting in Kharkiv, which is the second largest city in Ukraine, 1.5 million people in northeastern Ukraine. It's only about 20 miles or so from the Russian border. There has been intense shelling and rocket fire in and around that city in the last couple of days. Now we are getting credible reports of Russian tanks on the ground in the city, engaged in street-to-street fighting with the Ukrainian armed forces and local militia there. So very worrying situation there.
And I think we talked about this on Friday, Mark. The social media element to all of this is really important, isn't it? We're seeing a lot of videos coming out from the Ukrainian side, some from the Russian side, and people should be careful about some of that, shouldn't they?
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to be careful with the imagery that we're showing and waiting until you get legitimate and credible news organisations like Reuters or Associated Press verifying images and putting them out. We'll take it from there. I'm not saying we're not taking any imagery from social media. If we can verify it ourselves, we'll try to do that. But the fact is there has been some images that are circulating purporting to show fighting and incidents of very worrying significance that are actually taken from previous conflicts some years ago. So we just have to be very careful on that. It is no doubt, though, there is no doubt that the situation there is very, very difficult on the ground. There is significant incursions from Russian forces in various parts of Ukraine. There has been an air bombardment from Russia as well, involving missiles, aircraft, and shelling from troops on the ground into areas that contain populations. Now, Russia say that they are not deliberately targeting residential areas, but we've seen imagery verified that's come out that shows residential areas that have been struck. It's always a risk when you are involved in fighting in urban centres, then there is always a risk that residential areas are going to get struck like this.
Mark, thank you so much for coming in and giving us that update on where we are at the moment. And as the Ukrainian assault continues, citizens of surrounding countries will be wondering how far Putin will go and whether they will be next.
Millions in Eastern Europe await answers to that question. How fearful will these countries be as the invasion rages on? Well, certainly, it must be incredibly worrying to be just on the edge of a war zone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, obviously, Belarus is quite supportive of the Russian invasion. Some of the attacks came actually from Belarus into Ukraine, but there are a number of other countries such as Poland, Hungary, even Moldova, and I'm sure they're wondering what their future is and worrying about what's going on in their neighbouring country.
Estonia as well, another nation that's often spoken of. And Estonia, of course, the victim of a Russian cyber attack back in, I think, 2007, which took down websites of their sort of main news sources and the banks and really sort of crippled their nation for a good couple of days there.
The fear, Paul, that must exist not only in Ukraine but also in the neighbouring countries must be tangible at the moment. And we've seen a movement of people, tens of thousands of people from Ukraine into the neighbouring countries, but they too must be very worried.
Well, I think, as you touched on earlier, Arlene, there have to be question marks over Putin's state of mind, frankly, because I think this is an extremely foolish escapade tactically on his part, apart from the violation of territory and the fact that it's a war crime, effectively. You do have to wonder about what state of mind he's in, and therefore people on the borders probably are concerned, even, I would guess, those Baltic states that are now part of NATO, so the likes of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, etc. But also, I think, probably countries like Finland and Sweden, because when it was raised a couple of days ago about the possibility in response to the Russian attack on Ukraine for Finland and Sweden to join NATO as a means to defending their own security, the message from Moscow is that would not come without consequences. Now, that is completely unacceptable. Those are independent nation states, and as I said before, they have the right to join NATO. But I do come back to this point that we do have to look at our own role in where we ended up today. I mean, there's one person who deserves the blame for the invasion of Ukraine, and that is, of course, Vladimir Putin, no question about it. But we do, I think, need to learn lessons to give ourselves the best opportunity of making sure this type of thing doesn't happen again in the future. And I think context is important, and I think NATO probably does have to look in the mirror and think about its own actions in terms of the way that it did consistently over recent years make overtures towards Ukraine, in a way that some Russians did see that as a threat to their interests. So, and I think also, by the way, I mean, and this is something we haven't touched on yet, in 2014, an elected leader of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, was overthrown by what was really a violent mob made up, certainly in part, of ultra-nationalists. And he was a leader who was looking towards Moscow rather than looking towards the West, and the EU and NATO didn't like that. So, we were quite happy to stand back at that point. And allow, as I say, stand back. Some people might say we were actually complicit in allowing that mob to overthrow that democratically elected leader, who, by the way, was not perfect and he had many, many faults. So again, that is something that we were party to at the time. And for all our talk about defending international sovereignty, it seems to me that we're quite happy to interfere when it suits us. There's a massive backstory to this whole debate, which I don't think is being aired particularly in the media. I'm glad that we're doing it, because I think we do need to have that wider debate.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right, Paul, about the point of kind of looking ahead and ensuring that we do learn lessons from this, not least in terms of kind of global supply chains, because one of the potentially devastating impacts that this could have is on kind of global gas prices, something that we're already very concerned about in this country, given the cost of living. And so, once again, it can tie back to the debate we've had many times on this show about whether we're resilient enough as a nation. And I know we were speaking before the show about whether this actually is an argument that maybe we shouldn't be globalising. We should actually be looking more towards deglobalising.
I know Paul has talked about globalisation many times on the show, and there's a very interesting article by Janet Daly in the in the Sunday Telegraph today about is globalisation one of the reasons why we're not able to respond to what has happened in Ukraine. I know, Paul, you'll want to answer that.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's my view that the world really needs to deglobalize, and I don't mean that we should all go into our shells and not cooperate with the world around us and with our fellow nation states. But certainly, in terms of things like global supply chains, I think that our over-reliance on global supply chains has clearly come at a very, very big cost, and we're about to see that, I suspect. And also the destruction of our own industrial base. And I think we're about to see, with the impacts of this war and the impact on gas prices potentially, and the fact that we now have no independent energy security in this country, and we're reliant on the likes of Russia and Norway. I think we saw it during the COVID pandemic as well, in terms of PPE and the fact that we had no manufacturing base in this country and we were relying on stuff coming from abroad, and the impact that sort of thing has on the environment as much as anything else. So it's long been my view that we do need to deglobalize a bit, that we need to defend our own domestic industrial base, that we need to forget about the long supply chains and rely more on local supply chains so far as we can. And we need to probably see again the value of the independent nation state. Now, whenever I've argued that, particularly from a point of view of being on the left, I've always been hammered by the kind of liberal globalizers who think, you know, that's a terribly xenophobic and reactionary view to take. But I suspect that even those people very soon will be realising that it's probably the way we need to start going, because the cost will be enormous.
Yeah, so shortening supply chains and dealing with our energy supply, I think, will become really important. So coming up after the break, we're discussing the end of COVID restrictions in the UK, so don't go anywhere.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to the Political Correction. And again, loads of you have been getting in touch, and we very much welcome that. Peter says it's great to finally hear some commentators actually speaking of the need to see both sides of the argument as opposed to the usual BBC gung-ho reports. Negotiations will only work when both sides listen to the other's grievances.
A cheeky one here from Gavin, who says the people of Ukraine can sleep easy tonight because Angus Robertson of the SNP has written a letter to the Russian ambassador. That'll sort it.
And then Ken says the first casualty of war is always the truth. Thank you for putting both sides of the argument forward. It is great to see a news broadcaster allowing civil discourse from all aspects of the argument, and that's what we're all about, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, that is the very heart of GB News.
Yeah.
And we've got John here, who says, just to say we really need to kick out the Russian ambassador and all his staff in the UK and anyone else in their embassy to show we mean business. Sanctions are not enough and are slow to take effect. We expelled Russians for the Litvinenko and Skripal poisonings, but not for their invasion of a foreign sovereign country. Why have we not done this? I mean, threat of repercussions, I think, is probably one reason, but no, it's a good point. And I think, you know, we've heard the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary say that all options are on the table.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, this week, COVID restrictions in England officially came to an end, with self-isolation no longer legally required if you test positive for the virus.
Some critics have said the plans failed to protect the most vulnerable in society. Others believe it's time to completely move on and leave this saga behind us for good. And of course, in England that has happened, but in other regions of the UK, as you will know, Diana, there are still requirements in relation to what happens, albeit they're mostly in guidance now, I think, instead of that.
Well, I must say, as a Conservative, it has been really wonderful to hear our Prime Minister and our ministers talking about personal responsibility again.
Yes.
Talking about a sort of return to normality and asking people to act sensibly. Though I think there are a few people now sort of unsure what to do. You know, if you were to test positive for COVID, should you go into the office? Should you not? I mean, what would you do, Arlene?
Well, I mean, I think it's common sense that if you test positive for COVID and it's very transmissible, you would stay. Well, I would stay at home. It's a bit like if you get a virus or a bug and you're unwell, you stay at home because you don't want to pass it on to colleagues. I think that is common sense, and I think it's personal responsibility. Very much what the PM has been talking about.
Yeah, I'm with you, actually. I think if I was to sort of test positive, knowing the amount of people that I've come into contact with, certainly in Parliament, which is always a hive of activity, I probably would stay home. And I guess different workplaces will have kind of different regimes and rules. What about you, Paul? If you tested positive tomorrow, what would you be doing?
I agree. I mean, I think you ought to kind of treat it as any other serious respiratory virus. So, for example, if you had a serious dose of flu, you probably wouldn't. I mean, it's different if you have a sniffle, but if you've got a serious dose of it, then probably you wouldn't go into work and you wouldn't mix with friends, etc. And you certainly wouldn't go into the company of anybody vulnerable. So in that respect, I think that those rules should apply. I mean, there will always be circumstances where perhaps people don't have much choice in the matter, but so far as it's possible, then of course you should try to avoid people. But I agree that it was right and proper to lift the restrictions. I mean, my concern for a long time now is that we had effectively scared the population so witless about this virus that it was always going to be the case that whenever we moved out of the restrictions, a number of people were going to be afraid of it. And I think that's been shown to be the case. But previously, you know, when we lifted the restrictions last July, and people said it was going to result in thousands of deaths, that didn't happen. When we didn't impose the restrictions at Christmas, when many people said we should have done, otherwise it was going to result in thousands of deaths, again, that didn't happen. So I think the evidence is overwhelmingly in favour of lifting the restrictions, allowing people to live their own lives, taking sensible measures where people do test positive for COVID. And going forward, I think we need to reassess whether or not lockdown was the right thing from the beginning, because the truth is, as the Johns Hopkins University report that was published a few weeks ago, but got barely any traction in the media, showed that lockdowns came at an enormous cost. They estimated, the academics, that it reduced COVID-related deaths lockdown by about 0.2%. But the societal and economic cost, and the cost in terms of other health implications for people, was truly enormous. And I don't think we've properly had that debate yet. But yes, rejoice, lift the restrictions, and let us live our normal lives, please.
Notice people kind of really embracing the freedom, you know, in terms of like public transport and in the supermarket. I certainly feel as though a lot of people have been kind of ditching the masks now and really wanting to feel that normality. But have you both seen that reflected as well?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've been in London this weekend and it's amazing. I was here a couple of weeks ago and people were still generally wearing their masks on the tube and on the train. Now, very, very few people are wearing masks. And you know what? If people want to wear masks, that's a matter for them. If it makes them feel more comfortable, fine, that's okay. But I think most people, certainly 80% of people on the tube when I was on it, weren't wearing any masks.
And have you noticed the same thing, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I sensed actually that the mask wearing was dying off some time ago. I mean, you know, I think there are question marks over just how effective masks are, to be perfectly blunt. But yeah, I mean, I use a tube from time to time and public transport, and it seems to me that most people now will not be wearing a mask. And yeah, I can completely understand if someone's in the vulnerable category, why they think they ought to wear a mask. But again, it's got to be down to individual choice. People are entitled to make that choice, and you know, we should respect the choice of others as well. We should have frankly done that from the beginning, in my view.
I think it raises quite an interesting question, though, in terms of how much influence the state and the government have had and should have over kind of people's lives, people's movements, and those sort of behavioural norms as well. Because obviously, at the heart of the lockdown, when we were still learning about the virus, I think people very much accepted the sort of restrictions. And I think compliance sort of died off a little bit as time went along. But I think there are still people calling for kind of clearer government guidance when actually Isn't the stance be sensible? We know so much about the virus now. It's time to be sensible.
But I think, Diana, that's because a lot of people were told what to do during those lockdown times, and they're now saying, well, what do we do now? What do we do? And people are actually wanting the government to tell them what to do when they go out of their front door, which I find quite unnerving, actually. People should use their common sense. If they want to wear a mask, that's fine, you wear a mask. But if you don't have to. And I think that's the important message of personal responsibility. Anyway, moving on then, the government has further ramped up its battle against online harms, with more measures to tackle trolling and abuse from anonymous accounts.
Conservative MP for Stroud Siobhan Bailey has succeeded in ensuring the new measures will make provision for those suffering at the behest of users who hide their identities as part of a wider legislative crackdown on online abuse.
Well, joining us now to discuss this is Victoria Hewson, the Head of Regulatory Affairs, I can nearly say it, at the Institute for Economic Affairs. You're very welcome to the show, Victoria. Perhaps you could tell us what changes are being made to the legislation to tighten up on anonymous abuse.
Yes, thanks, Eileen. Well, this bill was already extremely long and complicated. You know, I've been a technology lawyer for 13 years or more, and I found the bill already rather complicated and difficult to interpret and apply. And now the Secretary of State has announced that they will be laying on even more complex multi-layered restrictions. And these ones in particular concern the, a mandate for platforms to allow people to cut out anonymous accounts from seeing them in their timeline or popping up on their Facebook feed. Now, what that means is that if you want the full range of reach on these platforms, that you will have to identify yourself. So the idea is you could still probably use a pseudonym or a nickname to make your postings, but you would have to be linkable to a verified actual named individual, which for me is actually introducing digital ID by the back door, because you will have to essentially prove your identity before you can participate in online debates in the normal course. So I think that's a rather worrying development. And then there's some other, frankly, to me, magical thinking ideas about how platforms should offer some kind of ability for users to dial up and down their appetite for seeing, quote, harmful content, which again brings into question all of these really difficult aspects of terminology that the bill rests on about this idea of harmful content. Legal but harmful content has been one of the most controversial aspects of the bill that the government wants platforms to manage. But of course, how do you define what's legal but harmful, and actually what business is it of the government to try and control lawful speech being shared and received by individuals in social media?
I think one of the difficult, you're so right that the harmful but legal is a really difficult kind of line to tread. But when it comes to actual threats and real vile abuse, I think one of the difficulties at the moment under existing legislation is that there is actually no onus on social media companies to even necessarily provide IP addresses. And so in terms of actually using the law as it sits at the moment and being able to actually catch people who are issuing threats, is this not a really positive step forward?
I think that I certainly have a lot more sympathy for the aspects of the bill that are trying to deal with illegal content. Where I struggle a bit with that, though, is that the definition of illegal content is also being expanded to include the new classes of hate crime, much of which is going to be very difficult for platforms to identify. Or, as it stands at the moment in the bill, all they would need to have would be a reasonable suspicion that a particular piece of content constitutes, for example, a stirring up of racial hatred. Well, the way that works currently is that there are lots of safeguards built into the system for the police to investigate these things, the Crown Prosecution Service to have a look at it, even the Attorney General in some cases has to get involved. And so the idea that a platform is going to be able to run algorithms, or even human moderators, frankly, are not going to be able to make very good determinations of pieces of content that may or may not cross this line into being illegal content, and will invariably err on the side of caution because they have potentially billions of pounds of revenue at stake in fines. So I think I would be more relaxed about this if it was really only about countering violent crime or child sexual abuse and exploitation. But actually, the government is actively throwing in hate crimes and the new communications offences, actually, which include causing psychological harm or even just potential psychological harm to someone. So even if you do just restrict it to actual criminal or unlawful content, we're already in some trouble, I think, on a freedom of expression perspective.
Mm-hmm. I suppose the difficulty with all of this, Victoria, is the fact that on one hand you've got the freedom of speech argument, and on the other hand you have the safety and security of women and young people in particular. And we know that there are some young people who have taken their own lives as a result of anonymous trolling and attempts to blackmail them and what have you. So it's where we settle on those two issues, and I think Parliament's trying to do that, but have they got it right is the question, and you're questioning the harmful piece and the definition. Isn't that the issue?
Well, it is, but I also think there is a wider question here about the concept of safety. And obviously with children, it's very different. And on that, I would actually say we're in danger of lulling families into a false sense of security that the internet has been made safe. And actually, surely, the primary responsibility for making sure children are safe when they are looking at the internet in their own home or wherever, that has to rest with the families. And I think there's a real danger that we are, taking responsibility away from the parents who will, as I say, perhaps be lulled into a false sense of security that the state is taking care of all of this and you don't need to be looking out for what your children are looking at online. And that could actually be quite counterproductive, as well as sort of really stripping the family of an important responsibility, which again is an important conservative value that I think is slightly being lost here. And then in terms of, adults being protected from harmful content, things that might have hurt their feelings. And the definition of harm here is really, the threshold is rather low. The psychological harm threshold could just mean feeling a bit upset, maybe being made to cry, which is clearly not a very nice experience to go through. And I've been upset by interactions on social media before. But I wouldn't expect the person who's upset me to necessarily be censored at source as a result of that.
Yeah, I understand that, but I suppose, like all bullying that takes place of young people, the parents very rarely know that it's happening until the young person finds the strength to come forward and tell them about it. So, unfortunately, online bullying is no different, and online threats. And I think both Deanna and I, having been the subject of online threats, know the difference between threats and harmful content, in terms of just being nasty and unpleasant.
And I do think one of the most difficult things with the existing kind of freedoms on being able to run anonymous accounts is when there are threats and IP addresses aren't released, and then they can't be traced back to source, and so the person effectively gets away with it, which is a real difficulty.
Well, I would just say on that, though, that the evidence about the prevalence of hatred and abuse coming from anonymous accounts isn't very strong. There's really very little evidence that most hate or racist attacks coming from anonymous accounts. In many cases, people are perfectly happy to put their name to this stuff. And oftentimes they're actually not even in this country. So it's questionable how much a national regulation like this could actually achieve in that respect anyway, unless we're getting into the realms of talking about blocking content from overseas, which is an even more
whole different debate. Brilliant. Victoria, thank you so much for joining us. Victoria Hewson there from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Coming up on the next hour of The Political Correction, we're looking over at politics in the United States and Donald Trump's new social media platform. See you then.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News
Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning, you're watching GB News, and coming up this hour on The Political Correction, we hear from New Conservative MP Anna Firth about her work and experiences in Parliament so far.
We'll discuss the latest on political developments in the United States and get an update from the Conservative Political Action Conference in Florida from GB News' very own Nigel Farage.
And prison reform. Is the system fit for purpose, and is it time for an overhaul? We'll speak to a former prison governor and counter-extremism expert about that. This plus plenty more after the latest news.
Good morning, it's 1 minute past 11. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Kharkiv's governor says Ukraine is still in full control of its second largest city. That's after Russian forces entered earlier this morning. Intensive rocket artillery exchanges overnight have been followed by heavy fighting in the area. Meanwhile, in Kiev, Ukrainians engaged with Russian-backed forces for the second night in a row. That as Russian troops prioritise encircling the capital. The Ukrainian president announced the country is setting up a foreign legion to bring in volunteers from abroad. Volodymyr Zelensky said the night had been brutal, with shelling of civilian buildings. He's calling for Russia to be stripped of its seat at the United Nations Security Council.
They are fighting against everyone. They are fighting against all living beings, against kindergartens, residential buildings, against ambulances. They use rocket artillery, missiles in city districts where there are not, and never were, any military facilities.
368,000 Ukrainians have already fled for Poland, Moldova and other neighbouring countries. The United Nations is warning the number could grow to 4 million if fighting escalates. Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the UK will take refugees fleeing the war. He's also said the Ukrainians are fighting heroically.
Things are not going all the way of President Putin. Very far from it. The Ukrainians are fighting heroically and in some places with great success, as many of us thought they would, because they're a great country and a very brave country. But as you rightly point out, there are some terrible atrocities being committed, and there will be some very grim days ahead for Ukraine.
The Ukrainian president says he's ready for peace talks with Russia, but not in Belarus because it served as a staging ground for the invasion. The Kremlin says a Russian delegation, including military officials and diplomats, has arrived in the Belarusian city of Gomel for talks with Ukrainian officials. President Zelensky has suggested other locations such as Istanbul and Budapest. Russian oligarchs are the latest targets of sanctions by the UK as the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss prepares what she calls a hit list. The UK and other Western allies have agreed to disconnect selected Russian banks from SWIFT, the international banking messaging system. It'll help prevent Russia conducting most of its financial transactions worldwide. Vicky Price from the Centre of Economics and Business Research told GB News the move could inflict a crippling economic blow on Moscow.
It will be painful for Russia without any doubt. I mean, Russia is dependent on those exports in order to distribute the money, if you like, to the population and keep them happy. Something like 40% of all the tax revenues that Russia collects come from oil and gas, for example. I mean, that's huge. If any of that is disrupted, then, you know, there are question marks as to how do you continue with funding the military or anything else.
Former US President Donald Trump has condemned Russia's invasion, calling the attack appalling. He also said that he's praying for the proud people of Ukraine. But speaking at CPAC, the annual Conservative conference in Florida, Donald Trump also described President Putin's action as genius and pretty savvy. North Korea has fired what could be a ballistic missile, its first since conducting a record number of launches in January. Japan's Coast Guard reported the launch amid stalled denuclearization talks with the United States. Police forces in England and Wales have recorded the highest numbers of rapes since Sarah Everard's murder almost a year ago. The Office for National Statistics also recorded the second highest number of sexual offences since April last year. Miss Everard was killed by serving Met Officer Wayne Couzens in South London in March last year. And rail firms are ramping up services that had been cancelled due to COVID. Avanti West Coast and East Midlands Railway are bringing back lines cut in December and January. For those coming to London, North Wales and Chester will get a second daily service to and from the capital, and trains from Manchester and Birmingham to Euston will be doubled from Monday. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's get back to the political correction.
Good morning, you're watching GB News and this is the political correction. We're here for the next hour to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. As you know, this is not about journalists talking to journalists, it's about you telling us what you think.
So coming up on this hour, newly elected Conservative MP for Southend West, Anna Firth, tells us all about her time in Parliament so far.
We'll talk about political developments in the United States with an update from our very own Nigel Farage following President Trump's speech in Florida last night.
Extremism in our prison, what needs to be done to tackle that? We'll be discussing that later on as well.
And we have common ground with a Roman Catholic clergyman. If there's anything that we talk about today, then do get involved by emailing us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is the political correction.
Now, on the political correction, we explore the work done by our members of Parliament and what they get up to on the ground and in Westminster to serve us as legislators and indeed their constituents who elect them.
And this week, we're delighted to have with us the brand new Conservative MP for Southend West, Anna Firth, who won the seat in a by-election earlier this month following the sad death of veteran MP Sir David Amess. Anna joins us now. Anna, thank you for joining us this morning and congratulations on your recent election. But I suppose I want to kind of go back a little bit to the campaign, which obviously was started under very tragic circumstances after the death of Sir David. How did you feel, sort of knowing you were running that campaign and stepping into such a big pair of shoes?
Well, thanks ever so much for having me on the show. Huge privilege to be here, and huge privilege for me to be taking over from Sir David Amess. And no, you're absolutely right. It's been a very difficult time for Southend. You know, it's been one of the most horrific times in the history of Southend. Fortunately, we are about to become a city next Tuesday. So very exciting times ahead. But in terms of the campaign, yeah, very different sort of by-election from the normal sort. Because in a by-election, normally, we all go hell for leather. All parties try and get as many activists in as they possibly can. An absolute battle of leaflets. You'll both know that from having supported by-elections, and a battle of ideas, and quite a lot of sort of banter and political debate. But this was very, very different, because you just don't know when you knock on a door in a by-election in these circumstances what state of the grieving process the actual person is going to be at. And it's been a really salutary experience for me to know just how fantastic our parliamentarians are. And not perhaps all of them, but certainly Sir David was a legend. And at literally every door I knocked on, the person either knew him, regarded him as a friend, they'd had him into their house, he'd been into one of their friends' houses. Some people still had candles and memorials for him. So we had the whole debate of emotion, really, to deal with, from people still grieving to people who were saying, well, hang on a second, we haven't had somebody in Parliament for the last 4 months representing us, and this actually isn't good enough. So very, very different sort of campaign, and I was quite sort of clear that we mustn't flood the constituency with hundreds and hundreds of leaflets. I didn't think that would be right, and even I was very pleased that colleagues came to help, but we didn't want the sort of usual deluge that you get in by-elections. I felt it was very important to keep it respectful, and I think the people in Southend agreed with that.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk about Sir David's legacy there, Anna, as well, because of course his major campaign was to make Southend finally become a city. And if I've got the date right, that's actually going to be happening on Tuesday, is that right?
Absolutely right. Pancake Day is going to be like no other in Southend. And, absolutely, this is Sir David's legacy. This is the thing he fought so hard for. And it's an incredibly exciting day. It's the 130th year since Southend became a borough council, and very, very exciting. Southend will become the UK's 70th city.
Oh, wow.
And Sir David himself, being a great monarchist, would have loved the symmetry of Southend becoming the 70th city in the year that Her Majesty has been on the throne for 70 years. So very positive, very exciting event happening on Tuesday.
Well, I'll be excited to kind of see coverage and see what you're putting out on Tuesday, and to hear from residents of Southend. I suppose a big question I want to ask you is, how have you found things in Parliament coming in as a new MP? Because I remember too well coming in as part of a huge cohort, which kind of felt like starting a new school. It was, like a freshers intake in some ways. But obviously you haven't had that same initial experience. So how have you found it in your first few weeks?
So, Parliament is Hogwarts on stilts. That's the way I would describe it. I mean, it's spread over 8 acres. Seems to me to be connected with it is connected by 3 miles of different corridors and staircases. And to me, there's so many secret routes here, there, and everywhere. I spent my first week permanently lost. As you know, Deanna, we're governed by the whips, and your whip obviously wants to see all her new MPs. So my whip asked to meet me in the tea room and said, how long would I be? And I'm over in not the furthest flung corner, but I'm not that close to the chamber where I've been given a little office. And I said, well, I'll be over in 15 minutes. And she said, well, I hope you're going to do better than that, because you have 8 minutes to make it to the chamber. And I said, well, that's allowing for me to get lost at least twice on the way. Obviously, I'm doing much better than that now, but it's quite an overwhelming experience when you're in a class of 1, because I am the newest kid in the big school, and of course you've got prefects like the whips who are there to tell you when you're actually not getting it quite right. So it's a fantastic privilege to be there. I can't emphasize enough how much hard work and how busy people are there. And speak in the chamber, which I managed to do for the first time last week, you really do feel the weight of history in that place. And of course, I'm joining with so many big issues going on.
Absolutely. And I suppose final question from me is, when you kind of look back in 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years' time, what would you like your legacy in Southend to be?
Oh, I've been really clear. I want to make Southend the greatest seaside city in the country. We've got this huge opportunity given to us now in becoming a city, but we've got to make the most of that. We've got to use that opportunity to put ourselves on the international stage, to attract investment, and in particular to become the UK city of culture in 2029. We can't go for that in 2025. That shortlist is already decided, but that's my immediate aim. I mean, Southend is the most incredible place. It's such a diverse community. We've got beaches, we've got heritage sites, we've got one of the oldest fishing industries in the country. I hope you're going to come down soon, Deanna, to visit.
Absolutely.
There's nothing to be done.
Brilliant. Well, Anna Firth, there, new MP for Southend West, joining us here on GB News. Thank you, Anna, and see you back at work tomorrow.
Will do.
Well, we've had a lot of you getting in touch with some GB views.
OK, so Joseph says this is a complete failure of diplomacy. I'm presuming we're back now talking about the Ukraine-Russian intervention. And we shouldn't have gotten into this tragic mess. And kudos to you at GB News for bringing in that American analyst. At least you're trying to even out the conversation and give a balanced narrative, which is difficult to find anywhere on mainstream media, which is full-on propaganda. That's Joseph's view.
Back on COVID restrictions, Royston says, good points about the choice of wearing masks. My wife and I are vulnerable, so we do wear masks. Sadly, when people were told to wear them, they didn't wear them correctly. Yeah. But I have to say the majority of people did and followed the rules. When you see and hear what people in other countries had to deal with through COVID, in many ways, we've had it much better.
Indeed. And then Sarah says on the online censorship debate that we had just before the break, online censorship never works in practice. I'm afraid the internet has always been and always will be a wild west.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the internet as a wild west is something that we all recognise in many ways. But moving on, this week, the American Conservative Movement are holding their annual Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, where Republicans have gathered to exchange ideas and mobilise themselves for the upcoming US midterm elections.
Last night, Donald Trump gave his keynote speech to delegates. In his typical fiery manner, the former president spoke about all the big issues. He poured criticism on Joe Biden's record, gave his take on the situation in Ukraine, and also teased at his own intentions for a potential rerun.
Well, GB News' very own Nigel Farage is at the conference in Orlando, Florida, and has sent us this update.
So Trump finished about 10 minutes ago his big speech here at CPAC. I've been here for the last few days, reporting, of course, for GB News. I've also done an absolute host of other TV shows, lots of American radio and television. GB News is getting much better known over here, I'm pleased to say. And it'll get much better known, I think, because the app is so good. So it's been really interesting. It's difficult to describe to people back at home the sense of energy, the sense of buzz that is created at this CPAC conference every year. And a lot of it, whether you love him or hate him, is down to Donald Trump. There's just something about his oratory, his style, when he's on those platforms, that really, really gives a big, big buzz.
And we will make America great again. Thank you very much. Thank you. God bless you all.
Less today of looking backwards, no mention of a stolen election, a rigged one, but much more about electoral reform. I thought that was very positive. On many of the other things, the big issue of the day, he said, look, and you can believe it or not, he says if he was president, Putin would not have acted in this way, that Biden was pathetically weak. He talked in terms of NATO, basically saying that many of the delinquent NATO members were now paying up. He talked well about NATO, didn't specifically say what he would do in the Ukraine, but there's no doubt the whole buzz, the whole tenor, Trump himself, I'm in no doubt he'll run again in 2024. I've no doubt the Republicans will do well in the midterm elections, and I've no doubt that actually the Democrats are in really, really big trouble in the USA right now.
So that was Nigel Farage giving us an update there from Florida. And Paul, there's no doubt that we expected Trump to criticise, I'm using the word very generally there, President Biden. But, I mean, Biden has been woeful throughout all of this, hasn't he?
Well, his ratings have plummeted, haven't they? So that, tells us what Americans think. And, the midterms will be interesting. And what will be interesting is how many Democrat candidates are willing to stand next to Biden in their publicity material, because his ratings are pretty low at the moment. I mean, I've seen, look, Trump's got a point on this. I've seen nothing to demonstrate that actually the grown-ups are back in the room, as we were told they would be when Biden won. I've seen nothing to suggest that Biden has done much at all, if anything, to heal the very kind of bitter cultural divisions that broke out in America over recent years. If anything, I think some of the stuff that he's done has just served to exacerbate them. And there's no doubt that Trump does appeal to a large group of ordinary working-class, blue-collar Americans, people in the Rust Belt, people who live in more disadvantaged societies, people at the lower end of the sort of socio-economic spectrum, people who believe that, they've seen thousands of jobs shipped offshore, their communities have been affected in a pretty fundamental way by the effects of the global market. And that kind of make America great again, repatriate our jobs here, really struck a chord with those people. And where the Dems have, very much like the British Labour Party, really become kind of very, very woke, very much more middle class, very much more liberal in their outlook, and have alienated, if you like, their traditional working class support. Trump has capitalised on that. So there are real parallels there. But he's not going away anytime soon. He's going to stand again, clearly. And I have to say, I suspect he's going to win.
And what do we make of his comments there, that had he still been president, that Putin wouldn't have acted the way that he did?
I mean, I guess he would say that, wouldn't he? But there may be a kernel of truth in it, because the reality is that Trump was so unpredictable that it could be that Putin may have calculated that it was too big a risk to do anything like that whilst Trump was in the White House. So in some respects, Trump's unpredictability and his eccentricity had downsides as well as potentially upsides. And it's possible Putin was looking at the chaos that materialised in Afghanistan, maybe recently as a result of Biden's withdrawal, and thought that was a sign of weakness. And if he was going to do something in terms of Ukraine, better do it sooner rather than later. So it's not one of those things I think you can ever say with any certainty, but there may be an element of truth that we wouldn't be seeing now in Ukraine, what we're seeing if Trump were in charge. I'm no fan of Trump, by the way. Let me just put that out there. Lest anyone get the wrong impression.
And you've always made that point, Paul. But, I mean, surely there's a bit of hypocrisy as well, saying that, yes, he's very sorry about the appalling invasion of Ukraine, but then to go on and say that Putin is a genius and quite savvy. I mean, you can't have it both ways.
Throughout his administration, Trump had a very odd approach to Russia. He would sort of swing one day from being very critical of Russia to next day doing the opposite and actually speaking quite highly of Putin. And there was all this stuff about Russian interference, and did the Russians have compromat on Trump, and is that why he wasn't as hard on Russia as perhaps other presidents would be? I don't know. I think it was just Trump being Trump. He's unpredictable. He doesn't necessarily follow his own argument. He kind of says what comes into his mind straight away, even if that's not consistent with what he said previously. Yeah, I mean, that's Trump all over, isn't it?
And of course, US midterms coming up in November. Those campaigns will soon be very much ramping up. And they don't need to make too many gains to actually get that majority. What are the predictions? Do we think they will?
Oh, I think they
Republicans?
will. I think they will. Given everything that has happened, I think they will make those gains. But it'll be an interesting campaign. It'll be a very interesting campaign.
Well, stay with us, because coming up after the break, we'll be talking about extremism in prisons and speak to a former prison governor about whether the system needs reforming.
That and much, much more after the weather.
OK, let's have a look at the weather for you. And the UK is looking dry again for many, although there'll be some rain towards the west. Zooming into the southwest, and for many it's going to be a sunny and dry morning. Parts of Cornwall will be cloudier, with perhaps the odd spot of rain too. Moving towards the southeast of England and East Anglia, we see plenty of sunshine, just the odd patch of fair weather cloud. For eastern Wales, also lots of sunshine. However, western areas will see some cloud at times, making the sunshine hazy.
We move back into the sunshine across the Midlands and northwest England. After a chilly start, it's going to feel pleasant enough in the sunshine, with temperatures beginning to reach double figures, my goodness, by lunchtime. North-eastern England will also have a dry and sunny morning, although winds will be fairly brisk along the North Sea coast, making it feel a little chilly here.
Well, heading into Scotland, and southern and eastern areas should see a largely sunny morning. Elsewhere, though, cloudier with some rain across the northwest. The winds are also strengthening in the far west.
Northern Ireland will also be rather cloudy during the morning, with the odd spot of rain around. It may start to brighten up, though, as we head towards lunchtime.
So this afternoon, not seeing a lot of change. Best of the sunshine in the east, further rain in the west.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and every weekday we bring you The Briefing live from 9:30 a.m. The stories, analysis, and live debate that you need to hear.
Quite right, Tom, of course.
Was this something that had been considered at all?
Difficult to answer.
Gas-guzzling helicopters circling. Noise is being made here. Joe Biden walking out. Thank you very much for joining us. Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, Monday to Friday, 9:30 a.m. on GB News.
Join me, Gloria De Piero, Monday to Thursday at noon for The Briefing. We go to the parts of Parliament that you won't see elsewhere. Plus, there's exclusive interviews with MPs from all parties.
But quite often, they paper over the real truth. Why does a working class lad like you join the Tories?
That's a good question.
Don't miss it, Monday to Thursdays at noon on GB News.
Welcome back to The Political Correction. Hashem Abidi, the brother of the Manchester Arena bomber, has been found guilty in prison of attacking a guard alongside 3 other prisoners serving time for terror-related offences, one of whom was the Parsons Green bomber Ahmed Hassan.
The event has raised questions about why extremists are able to associate and form gangs behind bars, sparking further debate about the need for reform in our prison system.
So does the system need a full overhaul, and why has this been able to happen in the first place? Well, joining us to discuss this now is former prison governor and counter-extremism expert Ian Akerson.
Ian, good to speak with you this morning. You've been involving yourself in the issue of prison reform now for some time, but did this attack shock you? Were you surprised that an attack such as this was able to occur in one of our prisons?
Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for having me on. I'm afraid I was shocked, but I wasn't at all surprised by what I saw. I led a review, as you probably know, for government in 2016, which identified quite a few of the problems in relation to dealing with Islamist extremists in our prison system that have since, unfortunately, come to pass. If you think about it, and your viewers will be interested to know about the environment, this happened in this ferocious attack. It was in the high security unit of Belmarsh Prison. Now, that is our most extreme form of custody, if you like, for the most dangerous prisoners across the system, probably some of the most dangerous and dedicated extremists included in that population in Western Europe. Now, why they were allowed to associate together in that unit and launch what was clearly a ferocious and coordinated attack on a member of prison staff is almost beyond belief. It's a catastrophic system failure. Unfortunately, by the way, we only hear about these system failures when we have inquests or when we have court proceedings that relate to attacks. Otherwise, we wouldn't know the extent of the problem and the pressures that frontline prison staff are facing within the system against very dedicated and often very sophisticated terrorist offenders, many of whom are serving very long periods of time in custody, decades, and have nothing else to lose. Yeah. How those three people ended up together in one spur or corridor, as you probably better understand it, in a high security unit with three of the other corridors effectively cordoned off for COVID use and other uses or refurbishment, it is quite extraordinary, as is the fact that the poor custodial manager who was attacked in this case, Mr. Edwards, who we all obviously wish well, seemed to operate an open door policy with some of the most dangerous people on the face of the earth, who still committed terrorists, able to freely get access to him and attack him. And of course, he said during the court proceedings that he feared he was going to be killed. And back in 2016, this is precisely the sort of scenario that I was warning against. When you have terrorist prisoners in custody, particularly those whose ideology is bulletproof, or indeed those whose attacks have been thwarted by the police or the security service, you've got a huge amount of risk. Belmarsh's high security unit carries an enormous concentration of that risk. So questions do need to be asked of certainly the hierarchy in the prison service of how it is possible that security was so lax this appalling attack could happen.
And Ian, I know you've made comment on the fact that the Ministry of Justice say that they have a zero tolerance attitude to attacks on their staff. Clearly, you would disagree with that given what has happened. But what's the answer to this? You've talked about separation centres. Perhaps you could explain what you mean by separation centres.
Well, again, one of the recommendations that the government accepted when I was commissioned to carry out this independent review in 2016 by the then Justice Secretary Michael Gove was the idea that the most highly subversive prisoners in the system, those who were intent on getting access to other highly violent and credulous young men searching for meaning in order to radicalize them, that those people were completely incapacitated from doing so and separated from the rest of the mainstream population. Now, I have to say, in all honesty, the prison service didn't want that recommendation that Gove accepted to go through, and they did everything possible, apart from refuse to actually open the units, to make it almost impossible by setting the bar so high that anybody could be put in these units. And in fact, a couple of them, after having been opened at great expense, were mothballed. So what I'd like to see is an expansion of those units. Now, to be fair, Dominic Raab, the new Justice Secretary, has indicated that he would like to see more use being made of these separation centres. So that's one part of the solution, certainly, is to get these people completely in a place where they can be subject to the right amount of surveillance There's quite a lot of naivety, I'm afraid, around, particularly within the higher echelons of the prison service, in dealing with ideologically motivated offenders. I think there's a kind of view that exists, which I've called in shorthand reclamation theology, that everybody can be fixed, that everybody can be saved, that everybody wants to change. And this is profoundly not the case. With a small number, what we're talking about in a population here of around about 79,000, about 210 people who are imprisoned for Terrorism Act offences. And of those 210, we are talking about maybe 2 or 3 dozen who need to be absolutely isolated and contained. Because the available vulnerable targets who are British citizens are the men and women who put on a uniform in the morning and go in and work, up close and personal with these very dangerous people. So there needs to be a transformation also in the way that we manage risk. I think the whole risk management system, and unfortunately, again, if you look at the inquest into the murder of the 2 students at Fishmongers Hall, an inquest I sat on for a lot of the time, you will see catastrophic failures and naivety and a disposition to believe people who are, deceiving some of the professionals involved in their risk management, to the extent that you get somebody like Usman Khan, for example, who went into prison a high-risk Category A prisoner and emerged 8.5 years later at exactly the same level of risk. In fact, some prison psychology reports say that he was getting worse while in custody. But still, despite all the evidence, thousands of pages of security intelligence that suggest that he was a violent extremist who was getting worse, who was intent on continuing his jihad in his own mind, he was still allowed to associate with a prison education external event that had students from Cambridge University there, and placed him on a fatal trajectory with those students in Fishmongers Hall some 18 months later.
Well, it seems like there's still a lot of work to be done, Ian, and I really want to thank you for coming on this morning to talk about this very important issue. Thanks, Ian, for doing that. And coming up after the break, we'll have our Common Ground segment with Father David Palmer, who discusses the situation in Ukraine, the end of COVID restrictions in England, and the latest with Canadian truckers. But first, here's your latest news. Don't go anywhere.
It's 11:36. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Kharkiv's governor says Ukraine is still in full control of its second largest city after Russian forces entered earlier this morning. Intensive rocket artillery exchanges overnight have been followed by heavy fighting in the area. In Kyiv, Ukrainians engaged with Russian-backed forces for the second night in a row, that as Russian troops prioritise encircling the capital. The Ukrainian president setting up a foreign legion to bring in volunteers from abroad. Volodymyr Zelensky said the night had been brutal, with shelling of civilian buildings. 368,000 Ukrainians have already fled for Poland, Moldova and other neighbouring countries. The United Nations is warning the number could grow to 4 million if fighting escalates further. Prime Minister Boris Johnson's confirmed the UK will take refugees fleeing the war. He's also said the Ukrainians are fighting heroically. The Ukrainian president says he's ready for peace talks with Russia, but not in Belarus, because it served as a staging ground for the invasion. The Kremlin says a Russian delegation has arrived in the Belarusian city of Gomel for talks with Ukrainian officials. President Zelensky has suggested other locations such as Istanbul and Budapest. The UK and other Western allies have agreed to disconnect selected Russian banks from SWIFT, the international banking messaging system. It'll help prevent Russia from conducting most of its financial transactions worldwide. And Niagara Falls has been lit up in support of Ukraine. The waterfall on the US-Canada border has been illuminated in blue and yellow, creating an orange-coloured mist. It's one of several landmarks around the world to be lit up in the colours of the Ukrainian flag as a show of solidarity for its people. TV online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. We'll have a full update for you at the top of the hour. It's back to the political correction in just a moment.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Well, welcome back to the Political Correction, and you have been flooding us with your views, and I think, Paul, you've got some... Oh, we're getting Paul, so we'll carry on over to you.
So this is another poll, obviously. He says, is this a move by politicians to introduce a shut-down public opinion edict? This is about the online bill, by masquerading as a Protect the Vulnerable bill. This will make social platforms so scared of prosecutions they won't allow anything even vaguely contentious. I don't really agree with that, Paul, but I understand where you're coming from.
That's what Victoria was hinting at.
Yeah, look, social media platforms regulate themselves, and I can't see them shutting down very much, if I'm honest.
Paul, over to you.
Yeah, I've got some here, lots coming in on Ukraine. Simon says, finally some balanced coverage of events in Ukraine. Warmongering on either side is bad for civilians, who are always the real losers in war. Mary says, something to consider. Why are British people who have had no hand in the war going to have to pay for the price for these Russian sanctions when they inevitably backfire? Tony on Ukraine says, slightly sarcastically, I suspect, Russian troops have been issued with ID badges showing their preferred personal pronouns, so at least they share our priorities. And on the online safety bill, Paul says, is this a move by politicians to introduce a shut-down public opinion edict by masquerading as a Protect the Vulnerable bill? This will make social platforms so scared of prosecution they won't allow anything even vaguely contentious.
And then I just want to say a thank you to Wendy, who's given us a bit of praise. Well done, GB News, for giving clear and unbiased coverage of the awful situation in Ukraine. Such a breath of fresh air. Thank you, Wendy. Well, moving on now, because Sunday is a special day for Christians, but we acknowledge that faith comes in all shapes and sizes. So here on The Political Correction, each week we aim to talk to someone at the heart of his or her community to talk about what brings us together, our common ground.
As we all know, Sunday mornings can be a rather busy time for those within religious communities. So on Friday, I sat down with Roman Catholic priest and university chaplain in the Diocese of Nottingham, Father David Palmer, and we talked about the big topics of the week. Here's what he had to say.
So joining us today is Roman Catholic priest, Father David Palmer. Father, thank you so much for joining us here on Common Ground. And what's your first topic?
Well, I thought the big topic of the moment really is surely Ukraine. And I suppose the incredible thing about what's going on there is the fact that Putin actually invaded. I mean, you know, you think, what on earth is he thinking? And one of the things I think is going on partly is that he invaded because I think he thinks, well, the West isn't going to do anything to try and stop me.
Yeah.
And, you know, so far he seems to be correct. And I think the thing about borders is, why do we protect borders? And I think normally we protect borders. Why do we go to war as well? Because there's something that we believe in that we're trying to defend, a way of life, a value system that actually we think that this is worth defending. And I think when Putin looks at the West, he doesn't see that, that we have that. I mean, what are we? What is the West anymore? And, you know, it was often said in the past that Europe was a kind of combination of Athens, Jerusalem and Rome. And of course, by that they meant the kind of philosophical beliefs of Athens, you know, the objective truth and the truth that could be discovered, as well as perhaps democracy, the kind of organizational structure of Rome, jurisprudence, those sort of things. And then, of course, the faith of Jerusalem, so kind of Christianity, that belief in the Christian values, which Tom Holland so wonderfully in his book Dominion kind of explained how that formed Europe. And arguably, of course, Europe was a church before it was a political entity. You know, it was kind of Christianity that actually brought Europe together. And so for a long time, we had a sort of identity, you know, whether that was Catholic, Protestant, but nevertheless, there was that kind of fundamental understanding of who we were and what we were defending. And I think in the West, we've kind of lost that to such an extent that we're not even quite sure who we are anymore or what we are defending anymore. Whereas Vladimir Putin has this vision of kind of, you know, holy Russia, again, perhaps even imperial Russia. And he has a very strong kind of vision that he is pushing. And I think he looks at us and thinks, well, they haven't got that. And the truth is, what would we be defending? So I just think it's very interesting that that kind of loss of identity in the West has made us weak, I think, not militarily necessarily or economically, but morally and spiritually.
And identity certainly is challenged now more so than ever before. Certainly during my lifetime, I could never imagine people who have a Christian faith are challenged all of the time, for example, and indeed it's the same with other religions as well. But do you also think, Father, that our previous reactions to what Vladimir Putin has been up to also play a part in this? So, for example, Georgia, the Crimea, and then, of course, what happened in Afghanistan last year. He's obviously been watching that as well. Have all of those issues said to him, well, I'm going to do this now because I don't believe there's going to be much of a reaction?
I think so. And I was having a discussion with someone earlier today, actually, and one of the intriguing questions is, now I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but I would ask, I just wonder if he was still the president of the United States, whether Vladimir Putin would have been quite so gung-ho. I don't know the answer to that, but I kind of suspect he may have been a bit more cautious. And I think, yeah, the fact that every time Russia does something, we kind of say, we'll make sanctions, but that's it. Yeah, and that's the danger, isn't it, of course, because, you know, in the Second World War, I mean, not wanting to push the analogy too far, but you know, we kind of kept trying to appease, well, don't come any further and that'll be fine. And then kind of hit the thing, well, they didn't do anything that time. And then eventually what happened. And the danger is, of course, as you get to a situation where by not responding strongly enough, the situation gets much worse. And in the end, you still have to respond strongly in the end. Yeah, worrying and interesting times.
Worrying times indeed, and no more so than for, of course, the Ukrainian people who are bearing the brunt of all of this. But to take you back home then, I understand your second issue is around COVID restrictions.
Yeah, the ending of COVID restrictions, firstly, I think this is a wonderful thing, because the reality is they had to end sometime. You know, you can't go on forever. Well, I suppose you could, but I mean, God forbid. And so there comes a time you have to say, right, you know, the situation is not going to dramatically change. This is where we're at. And so we have to get back on with living our lives. But what I've noticed is how politicized COVID has become. It's quite bizarre, really. So, you get so the university where I currently do some of my time, that might change, but who knows? They're saying, although the government has eased all the restrictions, we strongly encourage people to, still wear masks and still do this. A lot of the shops have said the same. Some churches are taking a sort of similar line, and it's almost like we've become almost terrified to live life, or not everyone, but a chunk of people have become terrified almost to live life, as if that life was ever without risk. Death is a reality for all of us in the end. It's still 100% death rate in the population. And to be scared of living life actually makes life less worth living. And I personally think we should have. I fully understood the first lockdown. I fully understood because we had no idea what we were dealing with, and I think okay, fair enough. But we've gone on far, far too long. A lot of people's lives have been ruined. And I think it's a wonderful thing that we've actually said now, look, we just have to get back on and live our lives. And it worries me that there's so many people that are still some of them so fearful still, that they're scared. And others, it's almost like a kind of a political statement. So, you'll get, and it's almost very oddly, sort of seems to have split to quite a large extent on the same kind of lines as Brexit and Remain, as if being pro or anti-COVID restrictions is somehow connected, to your view on Brexit, which I find intriguing.
Well, I think it is intriguing, and actually I was thinking about that, and was it the fact that people did like state interference in their personal life? Because I think a lot of people view masks, etc., as a crutch almost that they need. And I think that's incredibly sad. And okay, if people want to continue wearing masks, if it enables them to come out because they're fearful, fair enough. But I think we should try and move back to where we were. And I think that's what you're saying as well, Father.
Absolutely.
So the third issue that we wanted to talking about freedom is the Canadian truckers.
Yeah, the Canadian truckers, again, this in some ways this is connected, of course, but the difference between where Canada's at the moment, and hopefully maybe there's some signs of that changing, and when we're at, and you're thinking one country here that says, right, let's get back to normal completely, and another country that's still trying to impose vaccine mandates and passports and all these sort of things. And what I find so fascinating about the Canadian truckers is these are delivery drivers, who for most of the lockdown, when the rich middle class people were hiding in their homes, as has been said before, it was the working class people that had to carry on bringing them things. So throughout the lockdown, these are the people who were delivering the goods, the supplies to people in their homes. These were the people who, before there was any vaccine, were actually risking. They had no choice to stay at home and hide. They had to get out and do stuff, and they were kind of seen as heroes to an extent. Then these are essential workers. Now suddenly, Justin Trudeau is referring to them as sort of racists and fascists and Nazis because they dare to sort of say, to challenge his, I suppose, authority or his kind of vision, and how you can kind of take a group of people and whether you agree with them or not, but to kind of demonize them in that way when these are the same people who worked all the way through the pandemic delivering people foods and goods. And I find it's absolutely incredible. And it's the way that it's not just these people disagree with me, but it's because they disagree with me, they must be racist, they must be, fascist, they must be scum. And that's really worrying in our discourse as societies.
And I suppose it brings us back to the ability to disagree with people, but to do it in a civil fashion. It reminded me of Hillary Clinton when she called Trump supporters a basket of deplorables. It was an awful thing to say. And again, you're absolutely right, for Justin Trudeau to label people in that way and to use emergency legislation in the fashion he has has been quite incredible, actually.
Yeah, and it's not how you win friends and influence people, is it?
No, certainly not. I don't think it'd be an issue for that we could agree on common ground anyway, Father. But thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me
on those issues. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that was certainly a fascinating conversation there with Father David Palmer. Now, back to the ongoing situation in Ukraine, but from a sports angle. Pleased to say we're joined in the studio by sports broadcaster and journalist Aidan McGee. Aidan, there's a lot going on in your world.
Certainly, yeah. Well, we'll start with Roman Abramovich, shall we? There was a statement put out last night saying that announcing that he's given the Chelsea stewardship to a charitable foundation within the club. Now, I've never heard anything about this kind of thing before. I knew who the foundation was. They launched the foundation in 2010. Back when Abramovich had already had 7 years as Chelsea chairman. He'd had that relentless pursuit of trophies, which had been hugely successful. And he launched a charitable foundation to kind of smooth off his rough edges from a PR perspective, really. I don't imagine that anyone within that foundation, either then or today, could imagine that 12 years on, they're going to be running the club. Now, I believe it's a holding position for Abramovich. You can't walk away from this club, because it's not like selling shares. You can sell them in 24 hours. You walk away from this club, it remains your responsibility, even if you can flee to Russia or wherever you want to go. Now, yes, the framework, though, is going to stay roughly the same. The CEO, Marina Granovskaya, she's still going to be in charge of player transfers, player contracts, the future of the manager. They've got a huge game today, of course, the Carabao Cup final against Liverpool at 5:30. The wisdom of the timing, which seems very, very strange as well. I mean, I think he was doing it to try and stabilise the club ahead of a big game. They could move to 20 major trophies today under Roman Abramovich in 19 years, which is a hell of an achievement. He's the most successful club owner in English football. But I think that if you're a player in the dressing room, you're probably thinking today, something's not right here. And you'll probably be looking for your next destination. Probably the coach is thinking that as well. Thomas Tuchel, their German head coach, said on Friday that it's had a destabilising effect on the entire club, which nobody expected him to say. Normally in that situation, you'd come out and say, oh, everything's fine, you haven't really thought about it. But that wasn't the case this time. And the big game today as well, I'm not sure, I think the timing was ill-advised. They added another statement today as a supplement to the one yesterday. It's almost like the paragraph they forgot. I can read it out to you. The situation in Ukraine is horrific and devastating. Chelsea FC's thoughts are with everyone in Ukraine. Everyone at the club is praying for peace. Now, it's very glib. There's no condemnation of Putin's actions. But I think that in terms of the reason he's doing it, you look at the sanctions and the possible sanctions that he could be subjected to. Yes, they can go after him as an individual. He doesn't want them to go after the club. If the government decides to go after the club, they're effectively going after a charitable foundation. This charitable foundation has done great work with youth unemployment, improving the prospects of youth offenders. They provided a safe haven for COVID nurses during the early part of the pandemic. They have a Holocaust wing in the Imperial War Museum. There's no question they've done some great work. They've got some very able people involved in the trust as well. Hugh Robertson, the former sports minister, Emma Hayes, the women's manager, the women's team manager at Chelsea, Piara Power, who's been a racism and diversity campaigner for over 20 years. So I don't know if this means it's the beginning of the end, but for now, I think it's a holding position until he decides what to do next. And let's face it, none of us sitting on this sofa know what's going on next. I don't think he knows either.
And just briefly, I mean, there's been an awful lot going on right across the world of sport, hasn't there, with regards to the situation? We've seen tennis, the football teams. What else have you kind of witnessed?
Loads of stuff. I mean, we had the world number 7 in tennis, Andrei Rublev, just penning a note saying, don't go to war on the camera lens. Sometimes when you see players winning a match, they'll go over and sign their signature. He put a political message on there. Elsewhere in football, Czech Republic this morning have become the 3rd country to say that they're not going to be attending the World Cup playoffs. So the situation is that Russia play Poland on March 24th in a playoff. Now the winner of Sweden against Czech Republic in the other game could play Russia in the final. So they could be charged with the task of having to go to Russia to play. Ukraine against Scotland is a difficult one as well. 15 of Ukraine's team, of the 23-man squad, reside and play in Ukraine. How are you going to get them out of there to play a match? It's very, very difficult. I do think UEFA reacted quickly this week. They're moving the Champions League final. I think they deserve a bit of praise for that.
Well, Aidan, thank you for joining us, giving us your sporting perspective on this sort of rapidly unfolding geopolitical situation. But that's it from us here on The Political Correction. Next up is Dominic Frisby in place of Alistair Stewart. But first, here's the weather.
OK, let's have a look at the weather for you. And the UK is looking dry again for many, although there'll be some rain towards the west. Zooming into the southwest, and for many it's going to be a sunny and dry morning. Parts of Cornwall will be cloudier, with perhaps the odd spot of rain too. Moving towards the southeast of England and East Anglia, we see plenty of sunshine, just the odd patch of fair weather cloud. For eastern Wales, also lots of sunshine. However, western areas will see some cloud at times, making the sunshine hazy.
We move back into the sunshine across the Midlands and North West England. After a chilly start, it's going to feel pleasant enough in the sunshine with temperatures beginning to reach double figures, my goodness, by lunchtime. North-eastern England will also have a dry and sunny morning, although winds will be fairly brisk along the North Sea coast, making it feel a little chilly here.
We're heading into Scotland, and southern and eastern areas should see a largely sunny morning. Elsewhere, though, cloudier with some rain across the northwest. The winds are also strengthening in the far west.
Northern Ireland will also be rather cloudy during the morning, with the odd spot of rain around. It may start to brighten up, though, as we head towards lunchtime.
So this afternoon, not seeing a lot of change. Best of the sunshine in the east, further rain in the west.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.